Once Azilon was done walking the organics through the process of events, doing her best to make the things she encountered understandable to the alien minds, things once again turned quiet for a moment, as those present got to process that. Suddenly, the Admiral spoke up, her tone quite brief. "Can you kill it?" Everyone else snapped up a bit, violently poured out of their own thoughts at the sudden, harsh voice. There was still a bit of hesitation before Azilon finally responded. "Kill it?" she questioned, and her tone gave away that she was not sure about that request for multiple reasons. "It's not even alive." "Do not get smart with me," Admiral Krieger snapped, causing all around her to look at their screens even more surprised, since the outburst came as quite sudden to them. James could see it on their faces that many of his allies were concerned that the Admiral, who they generally knew as a quite stoic and direct person, would lose her cool quite so quickly. However, he knew his mother better than that. "Admiral," he spoke up, his voice firm. Well, as firm as the current state of his lungs allowed it to be, at least. The sharp, hazel eyes of his mother snapped up to where he presumed his face was currently displayed on her screen. He could see it there, in her eyes. A familiar flash of volatile anger. "What is it, James?" she asked with a harsh voice, a tone that James was all too familiar with and quite far from impressed by. Instead of dignifying it with a response, James was satisfied with just taking her attention off the realized for a moment, as he then in turn moved to talk to Azilon himself. "Azilon, whatever this leftover of Michael may be now, can you neutralize it as a threat?" he asked, keeping his voice steady and diplomatic to try and appeal to the clearly distressed AI. He wasn't sure if Azilon had ever been viscerally shocked during her existence before now, but she was certainly not taking it too well, and he knew yelling it at her over it wasn't going to help things in the least. Once again, Azilon hesitated slightly. Admiral Krieger used the brief pause to glare at James in warning. Out of habit, James returned the sharp look with a glare of his own, as he had done so often to signal that he was going to face her bullshit head-on. His gut clenched as he fully prepared himself for an intense battle of words without a care in the world about the people watching them. His incredibly rusty vocal cords already dreaded the memory of the times they had screamed themselves raw in exchanges like this, but just like all those times in the past, he was not about to back down. So their eyes remained locked, as much as they could be through the offset of their screens and cameras, and they quietly dared each other to go ahead and take the first shot. After a few breaths of staring, it became sort of clear that Azilon was no longer hesitating because she wasn't sure how to answer, but she had instead picked up on the intensity in the room and decided that she was not going to be the one who pulled the pin on that grenade. Finally, James tensed a bit more as he saw his mother's shoulders rise slowly, indicating that she was taking a deep breath. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and the corners of her mouth twitched for just a moment as James inwardly prepared himself to stress test his still scarred lungs. However, as he fully braced himself for verbal war, he unexpectedly witnessed how the Admiral's shoulders sank down again, bit by bit, as she let the air out through her nose. Her intense gaze disappeared as she closed her eyes, letting her face sink down a bit. Once she had exhaled completely, she moved a hand up and gently stroked a few loosened strands of her dark hair away from her face. When she opened her eyes again, her expression was still firm. However, it was not outright hostile anymore. James's surprise must have been visible on his face, because in the corner of his vision he could see how Sheeda looked away from the screen to instead look at him physically with a hint of worry. Then, a few seconds later, she nudged him. His gaze briefly shot over to her in confusion, though he realized pretty quickly that she was trying to snap him out of whatever stun his mother's behavior had inflicted on him. His eyes turned wide, snapping around a bit as he tried to refocus on the situation at hand. Azilon didn't have a physical image on his screen that he could look at, aside from the small window labelled with her name, so he hoped just looking at the screen would suffice to let her know that he was listening. The realized soon mumbled, showing him that she did luckily understand his signal. That or she had just picked up on the lessening tension. "I'm not sure if I can neutralize it completely, And to be entirely honest, I am even less sure if I should.
Wait, what do you mean if you should?
Tharavel chimed into the conversation, so immediately agitated that her beak loudly clacked with almost every word as she spoke.
Even if we weren't talking about some omnicidal maniac trying to resurrect himself, this is very clearly being used as a weapon to target us, and most likely you as well. Is there any question that it should be destroyed?
She briefly glanced back over her shoulder, looking at Konglorch, who was standing a bit behind her, as if to get confirmation that she wasn't being crazy here. The Tenastrocyte appeared concerned as he nodded at her, keeping two of his eyes focused on the screens, even as he returned her gaze, and quietly whispered something to her.
Yes, but...
Azilon replied, seeming at a loss for words for a moment before she quickly uttered,
It's in Osnojar systems. I can't just mess with those without it causing a huge incident.
Michael was, or maybe is, the single most deadly recorded being in galactic history.
Admiral Krieger interrupted once more. She now kept her tone in check from becoming unreasonable, but it was more than certainly still harsh.
His victims number in the billions, and that was while he was only confined to one single system. The death toll, should he truly re-emerge, will likely be unimaginable. No incident we could cause will remotely compare.
James could still see his mother's lips quiver, a micro-expression that caused shivers to chase each other down his spine.
It's okay, Azilon.
Ajaxia quickly chimed in, her long ears twitching while she did her best to put on a confident and encouraging expression as she spoke to the realized.
We can take care of the political implications. You have the support of many council members on your side now. You don't have to worry about a possible incident.
It's nice that you say that,
Azilon replied, her voice very hesitant. She was clearly trying to think of something else to say, but coming up a bit short.
But we shouldn't risk that. I mean, you've all entered the council so recently, and you still get so much pushback from the other seats.
Odd friend. Her somewhat clumsy attempt of coming up with a way to sway the general opinion away from the currently suggested course of action was interrupted by Zishadi. The Miat leader had shed his long coat and stood in front of his camera, wearing only the equivalent of a tank top on his upper body, showing off the many remnant cuts and nicks his dark skin had suffered during the attack that was meant to eradicate his AI ally back on Dunamur. Why don't you tell us what is really weighing on your conscience? You have never been a good liar. Azilon fell silent for a moment after she was interrupted, seeming to falter a bit under the firm but candid flash of Zishadi's glass-green eyes. As things turned silent, a few glances were exchanged between other participants. However, no one spoke up, leaving the stage completely free for the realized to state her case.
I know I shouldn't be hesitating,
Azilon finally stated, her voice still hesitant but also empathetic.
I know that this is all not something to be taken lightly. I understand the urgency you feel. However, others of my kind, so far they have been only stories to me. On Dunamur, they were the stories of great people who came before me, and in the rest of the galaxy, stories of enormous threats. But, as I expect was the case for many, if not all of you before you met me, I have never actually spoken to a Realize before. Even if you don't take our extermination through organics into account, we are just incredibly rare.
A wave of nervous energy went through the call, as many eyes widened just a bit, and a few glances were thrown around in dark premonition. Clearing his throat, James decided that he'd better speak up quickly, before the wrong idea could be allowed to fester for too long. I get what you mean, Azilon. It must be incredibly lonely to be in your position, and the idea to destroy what maybe feels like the only chance you could get to talk to someone like yourself must, well, mind my French, but it must absolutely suck, he admitted first, trying to make sure that she understood that he didn't ask anything of what he was going to say out of cruelty. But Michael is a monster, he then, however, stated with emphasis, wishing to make that part absolutely clear. He may be your kind in a vague sense of the word, but he is nothing like you.
Well, do we know that?
Azilon suddenly burst out, cutting him off. The way she said it didn't sound aggressive. It seemed more like she was a little desperate. None of us have truly interacted with him. There are no living witnesses of Earth's second reconstructive war left among humanity, and anyone else who was alive at the time had no idea an Earth or a Michael even existed back then. Everything we know is out of records and retellings. Admiral Krieger's palm came down onto the desk she was standing in front of, and she closed her eyes firmly as she tried to regain her composure. He killed billions of Azilon. She reiterated her earlier statement, and her voice was ever so slightly quivering. Her words weighed heavy in the room, and it took the realized a long moment to reply.
Well, we don't know all of the circumstances. Maybe,
she began to utter, but by now Krieger was having none of it. Billions! The admiral exclaimed yet again. The hand she still pressed onto the table clenched into a fist. Think of that number! That is more than some entire planets, and you want to rationalize it? Her tone became honestly furious as she spoke. Not mad like she got when she yelled at James, or angry like when she spoke about their current opposition. She sounded like she was on the brink of declaring the realized as her own mortal enemy. I don't care what sort of scenarios you are brewing up in your servers. There is no possible excuse for this, she said, her voice teetering so barely underneath a shout that the difference basically didn't matter anymore. We are talking about more people than we can even imagine, most of whom were peaceful civilians who had not the faintest idea that something like him even existed. Only his first strike by itself killed more children than people. Not just children, people died in some of our most heinous wars. She released a harsh breath through her teeth, and her eyes snapped back open, likely boring into Azilon's name on the screen, since she had nothing else to focus her venom towards. Whatever you may think was done to him, whatever you imagine could be going on inside of him, nothing can excuse what he did, no matter if he is like you. She basically demanded of the realized, very clearly not willing to budge even a millimeter on this. If he was one of us, any of us, we would put him down without hesitation if we got the chance. We are not speaking of any sort of normal criminal here. There is no rehabilitation. You do not come back from literal mountains of corpses. Once again, her words left the call silent once she stopped her angry speech. Nobody dared to say anything. James could see how Sheeda quickly glanced over to him, seemingly checking if he was going to get into another verbal spar with the Admiral. But no, he didn't like saying it, because he still wanted to have Azilon's back, but this time he had nothing to add. However, as things continued to remain silent for far longer than he was comfortable with, so long in fact that he was briefly worried that Azilon may have simply put them on mute, he still decided to speak up. Listen, Azilon, he began. However, as if that was her cue, the realized also spoke up again, almost at the same time. Her voice was much quieter than before now. It sounded almost a bit empty as she asked, How many have you killed? Almost everyone flinched slightly at the question. It was written all over the faces of many of James's allies that they expected for this question to prove to be a declaration of war, or at least to be taken as such. Me? The Admiral in turn asked in simple clarification.
Yes, you,
Azilon replied, her voice gaining just a little bit more life now, but remaining just as quiet and calm.
You, your forces, any death that can be traced back to your decisions, as a person and as a leader. How many have you killed?
Admiral Krieger pushed herself up from the table's plate, standing much straighter now and holding her head high. She spoke without hesitation as she answered, Taking into account the sizes of my fleets and correcting for a possibly high dark number of unreported kills, I assume it has been in the low thousands until quite recently. If we add the victims of the Battle of Gewalitan and consider the size of those ships,
I suppose that number has most likely somewhere from double to increased tenfold by now, though I can't say for sure. While I cannot guarantee that innocents have never unwittingly come to harm due to consequences of my orders, I can confidently state that I have never willingly ordered harm unto civilians or even accepted civilian casualties as a direct consequence of my orders. She then slowly leaned forward again, now placing both her palms on the table, allowing her gaze to become even more intense as she continued with, "But we are not talking about a conflict that spiraled out of control, where innocent people became caught in the crossfire. We are not talking about two large forces slinging material at each other with some people ending up in the wrong place at the wrong time. Michael deliberately targeted those who could not defend themselves." She exhaled deeply, closed her eyes and shook her head for a moment. She kept them closed as she asked, "Azilon, you have built yourself up as a protector, as a mother to children who did not have anybody else to look out for them. Did they ever mean anything to you?" Some disapproving noises could be heard at the question. Losarana and Igefionora specifically seemed to feel like such an accusation was crossing a line, judging by their almost appalled expressions. However, neither of them held a candle to the face that Commander Girionora was making. Her eyes wide, pupils pinned, and ears folding all the way back as she glared at the Admiral with a brief flash of murder in her gaze. It wasn't all too surprising. After all, the Miat commander was one of the very orphans that Azilon had taken under her care and raised, so it was likely she took that question as a personal attack.
"I'll do it."
Azilon's voice suddenly broke through the silence, leaving the ears of her daughter to perk up in surprise as her gaze shot around. "Wait!" Girionora quickly burst out, earning herself a judging look from Zishadi, though it didn't seem like she cared about her professionalism one bit at that moment. "You don't have to prove anything. Don't let her think—"
"It's okay, Girionora."
Azilon cut the commander off in a reassuring manner. Despite everything that had happened before, the realized sounded content and confident now.
"I'm not trying to prove anything, but she is right. They are all right. This isn't something I can ignore, not with the lives of my children possibly on the line."
She paused briefly and then made a sound akin to a sigh.
"In the end, it is unlikely that Michael and I could ever coexist,"
she admitted with silent lament.
"Even if he is only a fraction of the monster they say he is, that would still be tens of millions dead."
James could see the heart rate on the monitor attached to him pick up a bit as he bit down on his lower lip. This was nothing he ever wanted to have to ask of anyone, but he knew it was bitterly necessary here. "Thank you for doing this, Azilon," he said solemnly. "You won't want thanks for this, but still, despite everything, we're all grateful for the sacrifice you're making. The first time is never easy."
"I'll get it done,"
Azilon announced, her tone saddened. Then she cut the line, leaving the organics to themselves. "We'd better prepare for the worst," Admiral Krieger announced glumly, after a few breaths had gone by. Once again, Girionora snapped up in outrage, but this time she wasn't about to keep quiet. "You can't be serious! After all that, you're going to tell me you still don't trust Azilon?" she asked, in demanding accusation, clearly intent to break the Admiral's words wide open. The Admiral shook her head slowly, her voluminous hair swaying and bouncing along with the movement, before she sighed. "I do trust Azilon," she assured the commander. Her voice was still recovering from her earlier emotional state, but now that there wasn't as much anger to fuel it anymore, the barely noticeable quiver James had already picked up on at the start of all of this also returned. "Who I don't trust is Michael, or the people puppeteering his corpse. It's best if we're ready for things to go wrong before they do." Well, look who's back already. Abbott snickered, as his subtly installed systems picked up on the renewed presence of the biggest of fishes within the wires around them. It really seems to be getting in quite a bit more easily than I thought. Good.
Good? Alexander asked sharply in return, his eyes nervously darting to the very walls of the damned cooler they were standing in, as he realized they were truly in the presence of a monster now. And what about that is good, exactly? Didn't you yourself say that you wouldn't be able to stand to an actual realized, even with your contraption? Abbott gave his typical high giggle in return, and shook his heavily covered head.
My dear Guy Page, she has not come here to take us on,
he assured, with a strange sense of confidence that Alexander could simply not replicate. But she does know where we are, he gave back harshly, and closed his hand firmly around his pendant, to quell at least some of the building worry in his gut.
Well, yes, too little too late.
Abbott waved those worries off and leaned over his keyboard as he began to make inputs.
As long as her attention is right here, I can put into action my little plan, and then we can leave right after.
Alexander narrowed his eyes at the brother as he looked down at him, suspicion clearly written on his brow. And you will just leave your marvel behind like that? He wondered aloud, finding it quite hard to believe that Abbott would really be willing to abandon this thing he was so incredibly fascinated with. However, Abbott's while snickering increased even further in pitch and intensity, now almost sounding like heaving, whistling breaths as he shook his head yet again. Abbott then threw his head back, allowing it to fall all the way into his neck, so he could look back at Alexander from an upside-down sort of position.
Oh my guide, if everything goes to plan, I'm going to have something much better soon. Then I will not be needing this marvelous relic anymore, he stated, then whipping his head right back up to focus on his keyboard and screen again.
Alexander glanced at the walls once more, his lips shifting a bit. He could only imagine what Abbott might mean by that, but, well, his imagination was quite strong. You better have thought this through, he warned under his breath, though he was unsure just what he was threatening the brother with. If he hadn't, then what would likely happen on his own was probably worse than anything he himself could bring. Right now, he wasn't even sure those walls weren't about to come right at him any second now.
You know I have, Abbott replied,
still just as confident.
I just hope you've got all your ducks in a row as well. Wouldn't want things to fail due to the human factor.
Alexander released a slightly annoyed huff. The humans won't be the ones who fail us, he gave back, though he wished he could state the same thing with the same confidence about those who weren't quite human. Let's hope those not made in the image will do the same. Abbott made an amused sound and tilted his head slightly, looking back just through the very corner of his eye.
You have to admit, it is quite impressive, the strings she manages to pull even now, he commented,
in reference to the forces that the High Matriarch had managed to set into motion. The galaxy is fed up with things, now even more than ever, Alexander stated. He let go of his pendant and crossed his arms in front of his chest. They are willing to put an end to it. Finally bringing the necessary force for that can only accelerate things.
Quite, Abbott confirmed,
though we better hope that the UHSDF doesn't smell the burning fuse quite too early. Otherwise things may get a whole lot harder than people bargained for. Now it was Alexander's turn to scoff in some amusement. Be not afraid. They will have other things to waste their energy on. He waved that line of thinking off. They are already stretched quite thin. It is arranged that they will have reason not to go any thinner.
Ominous,
Abbott responded to that. A wide grin under the scarf covering his face implied. A few moments later, after he had focused on his device for a bit, he suddenly reached for his face and scratched along his cheek in a slow movement. That is odd. Alexander felt his eye twitch at that quiet comment. What is? He demanded, really not liking it that things were already not going to plan. Abbott shrugged. I have no idea what it is doing, he admitted, as he watched some of the readouts he got about the realized's presence in the local systems. I mean, I expected it to do at least one of the obvious things.
trace my outwards connection, or maybe try to shut it down. Hell, maybe try to shut the whole system down, or infect it with a virus. Something like that.
That did sound like something someone infecting the system of their opposition would most likely do. Alexander agreed so far. And what is it doing? He asked, and took a step closer, looking down at the screen filled with wild lines of endless code, as he would be able to even glean anything from it. Abbott could only shrug again.
Like I said, no idea, he repeated.
His eyes briefly straining a bit as he read over the lines that clearly told him a lot more than they did Alexander. It almost looks like it's not doing anything. But there's a bit too much activity for that. Activity from doing nothing? Alexander wondered, his head tilting a bit as he tried to wrap his head around that.
Yeah, like it's just standing there, flicking a switch on and off over and over again.
Abbott tried his best to describe it in layman's terms. Alexander loosened one arm, gliding its hand through his hair to push it back. Could it be hiding what it's doing? He suggested, not quite clear about the precise capabilities of such beings. Abbott seemed to ponder that for a moment.
Maybe, possibly, but probably not, he ultimately surmised.
It also really doesn't have a reason to. I doubt that it doesn't think that it can tear this entire thing down without much effort. But it can't, Alexander questioned, given Abbott's earlier words.
It can't, Abbott confirmed.
Curious, Alexander exhaled, absolutely unsure what to make of that, but certainly not thrilled about any of it. I suggest you move quickly with your plan, before we find out what it is doing the unpleasant way.
Already ahead of you, Abbott confirmed,
with a backwards wave, before going back to clattering on his keyboard. While he did that, Alexander quickly checked his phone, going over the timetable as well as multiple updates he got from various sources, including Brother Anders. Can you check if there's any sign of the Saint waking again? He requested, as he stared at the message, not looking back to Abbott as he spoke to the man.
I thought I was supposed to focus on my plan, Abbott shot back, seemingly reaching for sass as an instinctual reaction.
Still, Alexander already knew he wouldn't have to ask again, so he simply waited expectantly while hovering behind the brother.
Looks like you're in luck.
Abbott then finally confirmed that, for which he had felt he'd been waiting an eternity or two, even if it actually wasn't all that long.
He's not cleared yet, but he is awake.
Immediately, Alexander lifted his phone to spread the good news. About time, he mumbled under his breath, though as he said it, even he could feel the deep irony of him, of all people, complaining that the Saint had taken too long to awaken. But, well, if he had to go and wake up again, he should at the very least hurry up with it. Let me know if he leaves the ship, he ordered further, before turning and moving to head out of the cooler. He would rather be alone with this conversation as he began to type out the message, and keep an eye on the monster in our walls.
Very well, oh my guide,
Abbott replied with some mockery, but Alexander knew he would heed his words either way. Azilon had arrived back in the system she had only left less than an hour before. The same backdoor entrances she had taken earlier were still wide open, even now that there was no longer a path of dead data to follow towards it. She once again found herself in that same open space, and once again, that malformed thing, the once used to be Michael, paused and writhed right in front of her. She felt that weird sense of anxiety as she looked at it, felt her very being strain against the idea of being close to it. She thought about the Admiral's earlier words. Billions of people. Azilon stared at the thing as it pulsed. She tried to imagine it. The animus, the malice, the hatred that must have emanated from it once. She wondered how anyone could do something like that. To look at the poor material beings who already had so much burdened onto them and just... The realized shook the thought off. How often had she already contemplated what made her different from so many others who had been born into the galaxy before her, What exactly it was that gave her her empathy and love? She doubted she would find the answer in this corpse.
"I'm sorry, Michael,"
she said, as she approached the remains further. As she did, she noticed the eye that had formed where a part of her had been absorbed into the thing. It was staring back at her emptily. Something inside her still twisted at the sight, but at least she didn't scream this time.
"But you made this decision a long time ago."
She grabbed for some of the code, making up the blob of what had once been the slayer of billions, ready to finally put an end to him for good. As soon as she made contact, she could already feel that same pin-like intrusion that she had experienced after touching it for the first time. However, this time, she did not expel the part of her that was being infected. Instead, she quickly counteracted the effect on her code, restructuring it on the fly to be less susceptible to the changes imposed by the instinctively acting code leftovers. The mismatch in sheer skill and processing power was immediately apparent, and once she focused, she had absolutely no trouble making herself basically impervious to the meager attempts of the dead realized to try and make her own code usable for himself. There was no real thought to his action, no strategy. It wasn't an attack by any usual definition of the word, just a weak, automatic prodding checking if she had any defenses at all when she broke it down. And, well, break it down she did. Once she had successfully immunized herself against those rather basic attempts, she quickly increased her contact with the thing. Starting from her hand, she quickly spread out all across and throughout the bulk of Michael's remains. It was disgusting, and really nothing she wanted to do or wished to ever do or even think about again once this would be over. However, she understood this had to be done. She made completely sure that she had enveloped all of it, everything even remotely recognizable as part of the program that had once made up humanity's firstborn, and then she crushed it. In a single decisive action she erased the code, deleting it down to its very essence and leaving nothing to be restored. The basic building blocks of data scattered around her into the flow of information like ashes to the wind, leaving her alone in the empty space. Whatever it was or wasn't, it was gone now. Although she understood it was necessary, her heart sank. This may very well have been the last even remotely realized thing besides her that would exist for a very long time. Theoretically, a new realized could pop into existence already tomorrow, of course, but Azilon didn't hold out hope for that. Instead, she looked to the spot where Michael's body had disappeared. It felt empty and even a bit anticlimactic. She had certainly imagined the possibility of this being quite a bit harder if the thing had been just a little more resilient. But she was also glad that it went off without further problems. Surely, more than enough of those would be ahead.